I'm going to begin this morning with two readings. One is from 1 Kings chapter 5. Moreover, God gave Solomon wisdom, exceptional understanding, and knowledge, as vast as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom surpassed that of all the peoples of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, and his fame spread throughout the neighboring peoples. Solomon also uttered 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He spoke of plants, from the cedar on Lebanon to the hyssop growing out of the wall, and he spoke about beasts, birds, reptiles, and fishes. People from all nations came to hear Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. And this is from Psalm 104. You fixed the earth on its foundation, so it can never be shaken. The deeps covered it like a garment. Above the mountains stood the waters. At your rebuke, they took flight. At the sound of your thunder, they fled. They rushed up the mountains, down the valleys to the place you had fixed for them. You set a limit they cannot pass. Never again will they cover the earth. You made springs flow in valleys that wind among the mountains. They give drink to every beast of the field. Here, wild asses quench their thirst. Beside them, the birds of heaven nest. Among the branches they sing. You water the mountains from your chambers. From the fruit of your labor, the earth abounds. You make the grass grow for the cattle and plants for people's work. To bring forth food from the earth, wine to gladden their hearts, oil to make their faces shine, and bread to sustain the human heart. The trees of the Lord drink their fill, the cedars of Lebanon, which you planted. There the birds build their nests, the stork in the junipers, its home. The high mountains are for wild goats, the rocky cliffs a refuge for badgers. You made the moon to mark the seasons, the sun that knows the hour of its setting. You bring darkness and night falls, then all the animals of the forest wander about. Young lions roar for prey. They seek their food from God. When the sun rises, they steal away and settle down in their dens. People go out to their work, to their labor till evening falls. How varied are your works, Lord. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. I'm not sure how it is with all of you, but among my acquaintances, many people talk about the TV shows that have gotten them through the pandemic, the shows that they sat down and watched and binge watched that they wouldn't have watched otherwise. One of the shows that Suzanne and I discovered was a British mystery series called Father Brown, which is based on the work of G.K. Chesterton. And this year, there has been a spin-off from Father Brown, the TV show called Sister Boniface, which we have also been watching. Both Father Brown and Sister Boniface find themselves involved in police work in small towns in England. And just as with Chesterton's original Father Brown, part of the whole device is that people always think that they are stupid. They're routinely underestimated by those around them. And it's not because their detractors are actually paying any level of attention to their intelligence. It's because their detractors assume that since they are devoted to God, they cannot know anything about the world, that God's truth is some kind of dogma locked up in a castle. And if you become devoted to God, you lock yourself in the castle, and that's all you can see. And therefore, you cannot know the way that the world works. They assume that Father Brown and Sister Boniface and everyone else in the convent with Sister Boniface will have earthly lives that are parched and small, without joy or friendship or wonder. And I do think that those who underestimate what Father Brown knows about the world quite probably forget what Father Brown hears in the confessional, or perhaps they are themselves too innocent to imagine what Father Brown hears in the confessional. And whereas they think of themselves as worldly and Father Brown as innocent, I believe it's probably the other way around. But I continue to reflect on the connection that the Quaker author Paul Anderson draws between truth and the light of Christ. Some of the words on integrity that I read last week, I don't know if you remember, explicitly draw that connection between truth and Christ when he writes, "Each bit of veiled truth casts a shadow upon the light of Christ, which illumines and liberates the world. There is great freedom in the truth, but the path is one of humility. Genuine humility and self-esteem are always functions of living in the truth, and the root of truth is always the self-giving love of God." The root of truth is always the self-giving love of God. It begins with creation, with the creation of the cosmos and of the earth and of life itself, all these conglomerations of atoms and molecules, elements and compounds that become the catalog of the world. The very world expressed by the psalmist in Psalm 104. Everything that there is to be known, including what we do not know, arising in the self-giving love of God. The truth is a property, as it were, of God's being God, of God's godness. A long time ago, in medieval times, theology used to be known as the Queen of the Sciences. This was not necessarily the sciences as we know them. It was the beginning of chemistry and physics and astronomy. But the reason that theology was the Queen of the Sciences was because it was assumed that to understand God, you needed to understand all the other sciences. The church kind of put a kibosh on that when they decided to try to hem the truth in to dogma. But the truth is beyond dogma. And so faith actually is beyond dogma. And as a faithful person then, a person seeking to know as much of God as it is given each one of us to know, never the entirety because that's impossible, but the part of God, the portion of God that it is ours to know. We cannot possibly go into all the world to pursue the truth everywhere, but that's not because God forbids the truth anywhere, but because the world is too vast for us. But wherever God does invite us into the world, we can follow. And so a God-loving life, a faithful life, will be large in thinking, not necessarily large in consumption, nor large in drama, not necessarily with a vast energy footprint, not necessarily globe-trotting, but large in understanding, in vision, in compassion. This week, I read a memorial written for my friend Mary Peck, one of the most imaginative people I've ever known. And she and her husband, Morris, when they were in their mid-80s, took these long summer vacations to places where they wanted to watch the birds or something. She sent me some postcards from a national prairie in Oklahoma. The only postcards I've ever received where the image on the front is entirely an image of grass. Long, tall grasses. And she and Morris spent at least an entire day there. My sister's an ecologist, and she says it's very difficult to tell grasses apart, but Mary walked through that prairie and she could see the difference in the grasses. She knew them by their names: big blue stem, little blue stem, all these prairie grasses. And when she got back from that vacation, she stood in my office and she said, "Oh, Dan, the prairie was so magnificent, so dense. There was so much to see." And she said, "And can you believe it? While we were there, a man drove up in his car and he got out and he came and stood on the sidewalk and he looked for about 5 seconds and he said, 'There's nothing to see here.' And he got in his car and he drove away." She said, "Dan, can you believe it? There was that entire prairie and he couldn't see anything." I confess that at that moment, I really hoped that she would not find me out, because I could not have seen in that prairie what Mary saw in that prairie. She was enthralled. There was so much there for her. I think that the mind that can be overwhelmed by the dense and minute intricacy of the prairie is a mind devoted to God's truth. I don't think that Mary would ever have agreed to that description of herself. I don't think she necessarily would have seen her fascination with the birds in Texas and the prairies of Oklahoma as being faithfulness, but I believe that's exactly what it is. We don't have to have huge, expansive lives to have huge, expansive minds. I'm really fascinated by this description of Solomon when they are talking about the wisdom of Solomon in 1 Kings. He spoke of plants, from the cedar on Lebanon to the hyssop growing out of the wall. And he spoke about beasts, birds, reptiles, and fishes. I'm fascinated by the idea that the countercultural idea, actually, that being faithful does not mean being small, but being large, being generous in thought, being compassionate, struggling to understand, struggling to listen. Not measuring things weight for weight. But being always open to new experiences, that there is no dark place that God cannot illuminate. In the same way that I was challenged last week to see conversation as a search for truth rather than an opportunity to persuade. This week, I find myself challenged to see how much understanding I can bring to the scope of the world that is mine to understand.
As our closing hymn, let's sing the old rugged cross 186.
creating, redeeming, sustaining God. Encourage us in a generous way of seeing the world around us. Make plain to us your presence in the stars, in the clouds, in the grief of our friends and our colleagues. Draw us to those places where our own understanding is needed. Give us compassion for the human situation in which we are landed, in which we are anchored. Make our lives large in imagination and creativity, not expensive, but filled with grandeur. We ask these things through Christ who makes them possible. Amen.